Hi, and welcome to The Brood. I'm Chris, and on this episode, we're going to be talking about George A. Romero's original Living Dead trilogy, which is 1968's Night of the Living Dead, 1978's Dawn of the Dead, and 1985's Day of the Dead. Now, these could be considered probably three of the most influential horror films of all time, particularly in this day and age with television shows like The Walking Dead and the kind of return to zombie mania that's happened over the past 10, 15 years. Most of the representations of the living dead we're seeing in horror and popular media are drawn directly from the ideas that were put forth in these three films. So today I have with me a familiar voice, Josh.
Hello.
And our usual co-brooder, Letitia, is not with us today. So we have enlisted two new brood-ites to take her place for this episode. And they are Lindsay Denninberg.
Hey.
And Carlen Donovan.
Hello.
And these are both people with their own interest in horror. Lindsay, would you like to talk at all about, your relationship to horror?
Yes. I have a doctorate in the dead, as they say. And, I make horror movies, or I've only made like one big one, and the rest are horror movies. Anyway, I am very attached to VHS horror of the 80s, 90s, and some of today. And let's see. I don't know. I feel like, death and sex are my favorite topics. So I feel like, Romero covers one of them at least.
Okay. So you're great at the dinner part. That's
what?
And Carlen, what's your relationship to horror films?
I think I might actually be the oldest guest brooder today, and I was fortunate enough to be raised in the 70s. And I think that the aesthetic of horror in the 70s, both on film and in my case in comic books, as a kid I read a lot of both Marvel comics and there's a great DC comic called Ghosts, actually like horror themed. And so that the aesthetic of it, the sort of beautiful nature of horror has appealed to me my whole life. And as Lindsay points out, subject matters tend to be pretty engaging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you talk about horror in the 70s and the beauty of horror, because leading into the first film that we're going to talk about, Night of the Living Dead, even if by today's standards we watch Night of the Living Dead and think that, it's a little, it's just another monster movie, then we're completely ignoring the original impact that this film had. This was a grisly, stark, fairly intense horror film that was let loose on a unsuspecting public. And Roger Ebert has a great little piece that he wrote about, an audience watching Night of the Living Dead and its effectiveness and his take on it. His actually, I believe he was not a fan of the film originally, and then eventually retracted that and said that he was wrong, which I give him credit for that. But anyway, yes. Yeah, so 1968's Night of the Living Dead. I guess. Well, I think I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Before we get into the first film, I did want to ask each of you individually, or maybe collectively. Now in 2014, it's still going strong. Why the living dead? Why zombies? Why are we still so interested in this? Why does it have, why does it still have such a life? And I don't know. It's interesting to me. I mean, if we can draw this idea back further past, Romero's films, but he really, the specifics of it or something are really his invention. But why zombies, first of all? And Josh, since you are a veteran, I'm going to throw that very big ball into your court.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I can speak to why it's got such legs, why it's been so enduring, but I mean, I think to me the appeal of the zombies is just that indeterminacy, it's and I mean, even a lot of our horror movie monsters play into the same thing. The Freddys and the Jasons aren't just madmen in the woods. They're creatures who do not die. There's that they exist somewhere in that liminal space between life and death, and that's about as kind of primal as you can get in terms of shaking up the status quo. When you erase those lines. I also think that there's something in the present day that there's something almost. I mean, God knows there's actually like news articles about it. Talking about should we be worried about a zombie plague? That there's this kind of pseudoscience that permeates everything in our culture right now. That it almost seems like a quasi believable scenario. Like I mean, that's sad to say, but I think it's true.
Yeah, no, I
don't know if it's sad.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt. I was just like, I wouldn't take it as a sad perspective, just like in response to that, I guess, why The Living Dead, because very, very interesting points. I'm trying to think. Well, I don't know. It seems like with all big art movements that are very raw and have a lot of impact, that it always seems to follow some big historical, like, tragic event. And 9/11 wasn't that long ago, so we haven't really talked about it. It seems to be coming back in this weird regurgitation of the past. But the interesting thing about The Living Dead, I think the most, especially for Romero, because not all zombie films follow this, is that his zombie films, you're never really sure why the dead are coming back. It's just arbitrarily like referenced or alluded to that hell is full and, they need to walk the earth and all of that. So, it just leaves a lot to chew on. And because he never answers the question, we're going to constantly wonder about it, just like we're going to wonder like where we're going to go when we die, if we're going to go anywhere. So I don't know. Those are my musings.
Yeah, I mean, when we die, apparently we're going to go to the mall. But
yes,
also,
we'll all walk the mall.
But I do think what you're saying about the cause is always obscured and never. I mean, there is talk of it in Night of the Living Dead, but it kind of is forgotten in the rest of the films, that the cause is indeterminate as well, So there is this ambiguity, and I think that's the very primal fear that he is playing on, the indeterminacy on the nature of these creatures, but also a shifting world that all of a sudden doesn't have the same rules. Carlen?
I think I think you've gotten to the heart of it there, because unlike the other monsters that I know that you all have covered on The Brood and that film covers, even zombies in their earlier incarnations were kind of individuals who were enslaved, but in this case, that indeterminacy of cause, the indeterminacy of their status and their numbers kind of raise this to this apocalyptic level, and it is a monster for apocalyptic times. This is definitely a post-Cold War monster, and certainly a post sort of civil rights, Vietnam, and now, as Lindsay points out, post 9/11 kind of monster, because it does suggest not just our personal ends, but bigger ends.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
culture
that. Say that. Sorry, Chris. It's funny that we associate this. It's so easy to associate zombies with movements. Which you're getting at, I think, Carlen. When they are kind of by definition the least organized, kind of so it's like there's almost something, a critique built in there just with that construction even.
Yeah.
I do think that mentioning post Cold War and even contemporary like quote unquote issues like building walls to keep people out of
yes.
states. I mean this idea that it's a faceless horde that is coming at us, and I think it does. I mean, Romero, I think, is always very politically minded and wants to kind of almost dramatize this very conservative fear. I think there's two tracks going on, and very quickly I do want to lead in Night of the Living Dead, but two tracks of one of deep existential fear and one of an almost dramatizing lampooning of a certain kind of, dare I say, bourgeois fear, and yes. What you get is something that I think is quite entertaining. And but let's move into Night of the Living Dead. Where do we see that happening in Night of the Living Dead? Well, first of all, would someone like to summarize the film Night of the Living Dead?
Chris, if there's something I know about you, it's that you love to summarize films.
Okay, I'm going to take the enviable job of summarizing Night of the Living Dead.
Oh, that's the best one. Okay.
All right. I'm going to try to do it as quickly and concisely as possible. A woman and her brother go to a cemetery, a rural cemetery, to put flowers on the grave of a loved one. While there, they are attacked by a living dead creature. The main character, arguably, Barbara's brother, is killed. She runs away, takes refuge in an old farmhouse, and encounters another man that is also taking refuge from the living dead creatures. And they hold up in this house trying to protect themselves and figure out what's going on as more and more of these creatures start amassing outside of the house. And later on in the film, it's revealed that there are people hiding in the basement, also hiding from, we'll just call them zombies, even though the film doesn't refer to them as such. There's also people in the basement trying to escape these creatures that are attacking them. It's really like a drama of survival and these kind of like relationships and that are formed between these people, and just trying to escape these apparently, unstoppable force that's attacking them, these creatures. I think that's a very general idea of what the film is, but there's so much more going on in specific characters and ideas, and also like an important element is that essentially our protagonist, or arguably our main character, is a black man surrounded by white people. There's a real tension that's created there. There's a lot going on in this film. It's a great horror film, but it's also just a very substantial, meaty film with a lot of things to chew on.
Like flesh.
Yeah, sorry. It's inevitable. Yeah, so Night of the Living Dead. What are the first things that we see in that film that we see continue throughout the Living Dead trilogy that are worthy of note?
Bourgeois is the word, man.
Yeah, right. I would say, just the most obvious things, because stylistically they're pretty wildly different, so you can't. It's hard to talk about sort of technical aspects, but just that, the types of character. We've got the same, essentially, two survivors who are of a type, which is, a highly competent sort of black male character and an increasingly competent female character always end up being the sorry, spoilers if you haven't seen this film.
That's fine.
Arguably, though, in Day of the Dead, she's a little stupid sometimes.
Oh yeah, well, and Barbara, bless her heart, she's a little, she's clearly, and I think that's
a long movie.
So. Yeah. So that's one of the things that we see. They're all they're all pretty argumentative movies, and not just the characters, making arguments, and I think maybe Josh pointed this out in an email, like each of these films seems to be making some pretty clear statements. And I think, again, I can't can't talk about the stylistic stuff, but I'd say that just broadly speaking, those are a couple obvious balloons to pop.
It's funny that you
Yeah.
say that, Carlen, that because they're also argumentative in the other way. I mean, they do have an argument to make, but they also, both films are, about half of the running time is just these people screaming at each other, about what they're
with varying degrees of success in terms of being heard.
Right, and that just that I think is kind of when you actually look at the amount of time that is spent, just and I think that gets worse as the trilogy wears.
Yes.
By the time you get to today, it's like you just kind of want all these people to die.
It's Jerry Springer, late Jerry Springer by then.
Exactly.
Or like an upper division undergrad, like.
Well, I was going to say, it is interesting that Romero uses this maybe science fiction or supernatural device to essentially create this intense discussion that's happening, obviously, on a larger scale with how the films are operating, but also, on a dramatic level, on a character level where these people are arguing. He's like creating almost like a town hall, or like a kind of forcing people to face each other that would not necessarily face each other. And Night of the Living Dead, I think, is the first, and arguably the best at doing that.
And always contrasted with the absolutely unified actions of the dead.
Yes. That's very interesting. I mean, because we have, I feel like there is this idea that we've put these people together that are from different walks of life that wouldn't necessarily ever interact with each other, but obviously in a larger socio-political way, their actions are affecting each other. Now they have to interact, they have to talk, they have to make decisions together because that's the burden of their freedom, essentially. But we have this faceless thing that's outside that can act with one goal, one mind, in essence, in a certain sense, that does not have this like burden of freedom, that these people have, and it's very effective. So I think it's an interesting thing that Romero is getting at, that in essence their humanity is what they're protecting, but also if it's not carefully tended and addressed, it can be their destruction.
It's a terrible obstacle.
Well, it's interesting.
That's what makes these. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Oh, sorry. When you said the burden of freedom, it seems to be like the biggest argument of it isn't more in Dawn of the Dead because of the mall situation and just kind of they're becoming the automatons that Romero keeps referring to with the mannequins and such. Like pretty much like the gray area of like, are you more free as a living dead person or a dead living person?
Yeah, and the contrast that draws. And I think when we talk about Dawn of the Dead, I think that by far is the bleakest, most scathing of all of these films. And I mean, ultimately, I think the series does absolutely reach its pinnacle with that film. But
I was just gonna say, I think that the cynicism that's in these movies is so palpable. I mean,
yes.
And I think that's what it is, because it's the what in each of the films what undoes any hope for survival, or even if they were to survive, any hope for anything productive coming out of their survival, totally comes from within. It's the infighting and it's other groups of the living that starting a fight over territory, whatever. That in the end, it's the living dead are just kind of a catalyst that gets things moving. But of course, in all of these stories, it devolves completely within the group.
Which is, these aren't films that think highly of humanity, obviously, but and that's reiterated in these fairly extravagant ways that both zombies and humans are destroyed. It's like the film actively attacks humanity.
Survival of the shittiest.
And I think that also there's, pretty much what you guys are saying, that just this, by changing one element of reality, that death is not the end, and that the dead will return with one very basic desire, one very basic need. Just one thing changing in the nature of reality exposes the fragility of the societies that we've built, that are built on some amount of inequality and oppression and consumer, any number of things. I mean, I think Romero is a pretty widespread critique of many, many things. But I think that is, at least for me, what's going on here. One element changes and the whole house of cards falls down. And it is interesting to look at, I think it's the zombies as this other group, this faceless mass of the other that now is something that has to be accounted for and has a desire. And I think it's kind of amusing and brilliant that they have one almost right that they're asking for. And that's simply the right to eat human beings.
Well, speaking of that, like, what is it, with Dawn of the Dead, like the guy with the eye patch in the news when he's talking about, like, they're not cannibals. They're not eating themselves. This is a different species now. And it's interesting because it's just like, is it a devolution? Is this like Cro-Magnons versus Neanderthals at this point now? I don't know. I'm just like, I love that eye patch guy. I just wanted to bring him up. I didn't want to forget about him.
Well, let's talk about that because he is on the news. In an email, you brought up a good point. The place of, from the very beginning, from the first film, we see the presence of media and these human beings getting their instructions and their very partial knowledge of what's going on from television. They will just have a connection to the outside world. What role does media play in these films?
Well,
I guess particularly Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah. Well, for Night of the Living Dead, I'm trying to think, like, the first things we hear about is through the radio. And when I was watching it again today, like, when Ben's, like, hammering up everything, the entire soundtrack is the radio. So it's like, and it's funny because he's multitasking, trying to get everything together. He's taking care of everything. So it's always there. It's always informing us. But as the news goes on and reveals more and more, at least in Night of the Living Dead, like, they don't know what's going on either. There's about, like, Romero himself is playing the news anchor, asking these three guys walking up down a street. Seems like it's an army guy, science guy, and some other guy. And they're all at odds trying to hide the fact that, like, no, they don't know what's going on either. And the news just keeps going on. And
well, I think it's the radio that draws that family upstairs even, right? It actually brings these groups together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it brings them together, and then was it the mother of the little zombie girl at the end, like, yells at them, like, they have a radio, we have no other way of getting up there or finding out what's going on. And I don't know, just it's so I actually, like, ripped a bunch of the soundtrack once for a movie. And most of it is the radio, like, they can't even take it out of the soundtrack. So, like, what is it, I don't even know, it's just.
Well, I think there's moments where there's just sort of a TV that shows up. It just cuts to television footage. So the television itself is kind of a character.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And it's also it's this usually comforting presence that we see devolve as the films go on and then basically disappear by
I think it's just a newspaper at the very beginning of Day of the Dead, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I think I feel like in Night of the Living Dead that the media starts out as just a technique, a quick way to communicate information. I mean, like
exposition.
Exactly. A pretty cheap way without having to. This was a movie done for next to nothing, and so we can just get that. And I think that by the end, it has become something else. I mean, the way the final shots of the film devolve into these, like, newsprint photographs of Ben's death and everything, that we kind of see the movie turn into a news story as it progresses.
And I say that is just the most beautiful quality that this film has visually. I think it's very, Vajete-ish. It's really, and I think that it's interspersed with, I think it's still frames, and then there's some motion kind of right in the middle of it. It's just really, I think you're right. I hadn't really thought about how it progresses. I wonder what the shooting order was.
No, that's a beautiful element of this film, and the fact that it does end there, where it almost is a very cynical view of things, where in this apocalyptic scenario, all of some possibilities open up because the order of things are shifting around. But by the end, very familiar people are back in control. People with guns that are doing, whatever they're doing. And then we're getting these newsprint quality photos that are being snapped. And all of a sudden, it almost solidifies something that was liquid, like a changing order. And now we see that all of a sudden it becomes media, it becomes news, it becomes more solid. And now this time of essentially maybe revolution, we could call it, is no more.
I was just thinking about other films that kind of kill off their protagonists, and I mean this. We could compare this with a Cool Hand Luke or something. They're very similar in terms of the kind of the denouement there, but I don't know. I think cynical is really the word. It is so cold the way that ends. I mean, just the way that he's. This character that we've really come to identify with and we really attach ourselves to, he's the only one that you can really kind of cling to in this movie. And the movie just kind of completely erases his humanity in a shot. It's we don't even have time to feel bad about him. He just becomes something else.
I read somewhere today that Romero was thinking of not having him die at the end, and Dwayne Jones said no, we have to do it. The black people will not like it if you don't kill me off. So I
wow.
reading more about him, I think he brings a lot of sophistication to the film that because Romero's great and everything, but you can see who he learned from almost as he goes on. So I don't know who he learned from by the time he got to Day of the Dead, but I don't know. Tom Savini too much. I don't know.
It's performance, and I think there is something that it's cynical, but it's also realism, and it's a very stark statement that the film makes, because in this time of tension and people banding together, and Dwayne is making making a lot of decisions and doing a lot of to organize and taking essentially control of the situation as best he can. And all of a sudden, when it's back into we're back confronted by a mass of people, his life is just taken away immediately. It's so fragile. When faced again with the status quo, it's this horror of just being not being respected as a human being. I think that's really an intense moment, and I think that's something that helps this film to be absolutely iconic, and is something that very much assured that it wouldn't fall in with the kind of the idea of these other 50s, 60s monster movies.
To play devil's advocate for a second, though, with his death, just thinking on the fact, why would he want to continue to live in a world where those are the people that are left? I mean, maybe it's a poetic, tragic justice or something for him. I don't know. Just it's better off, probably.
Yeah. Here's an interesting idea that I always think about when I watch Night of the Living Dead, is this idea of this recognition of what's happening psychologically, recognizing someone ostensibly as a human being, but knowing that they're not human. And this is something we have talked about before on Rude, but like this idea that this something else, that something that appears to be something and is actually something else. And I think that is one of the greatest moments in horror, when Barbara is first approached by the first zombie in the cemetery, and the way that that's crafted. Like we see him from a distance, he gets closer and closer, he's finally recognized as seemingly a human being, maybe just a crazy person. But there's something, it just gets more and more terrifying. I don't really know. I'm kind of just...
Yeah. No, there's real dread in that scene, and there's real... And I think what makes it amazing is that it's really bright. It's very, very brightly lit. And it's... And I think just keeping him basically in that part of the frame while he's trucking up to him, it's... You have that slower build and that sense of dread is the word I keep coming back to. There's something very, very wrong. And it's, there's that question of looking human and not being human. And that comes up with a ton of the monsters y'all have talked about on the show.
Yeah.
And that question of soullessness, I guess. But in this case, it's something so much more base, I guess. Vampires might not have souls, but they have manners and nice clothes.
Yeah. Vampires. It is very interesting that you bring up that that this happens during the day. Like, possibly the most frightening part of Night of the Living Dead is what happens before night falls. And I think that definitely is another moment that distinguishes this film as something that is essentially changing rules and exposing us to a new kind of horror just by simply doing something different. And I think that is, to me, the most horrifying scene in the film, and it is something that shows us that even the daytime now is not anything sacred.
Yeah.
You're
I think
not
it's kind of, in some ways, it's the scariest. I don't know if it's the most horrifying. I'd like to hear do Lindsay and Josh, do you agree that that's the scariest moment?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant set piece. The whole, just that whole piece there, just kind of shot by shot even. And it's also unique that the other movies certainly don't begin there. And we don't really ever have a moment. I mean, it's literally like the only moments of normalcy that we get in Romero's movies, period. Mm-hmm. From there on out, everything devolves. And it's also, I think it's clever. It's clever. It's kind of funny, and it kind of takes this kind of humorous view, introduces the zombies again, as was said, with zero lead up, zero explanation. It's just, here we are. But also just, sets the thematic tune. I mean, their whole conversation is kind of about the tyranny of the dead, right? I mean, it's our job to go and, visit the grave. Nobody wants life interrupted by all this, ridiculous taking care of, this bowing down to death that we have to do, and her brother's so kind of up in arms about it, and then and it basically, the zombie becomes like a punchline, here it is. It's a completely different tone, I think, than the rest of the movie.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think I had an epiphany just hearing everyone else talk that these movies I don't think are really scary. Like, I'm not, not in a bad way. Like, they don't scare me. Like I'm not, this is happening. I just fascinated. I'm like, oh, they're dead and they're living. I want to see what happens. What, what is it, like watching National Geographic documentary or something? More
I agree. I think that there is it is a different experience than some other kinds of horror. That it is an intellectual kind of horror, and I think that's the way Romero structures these films. I mean, I think that there's not there's not even much in the way of jump scares or anything like that. You know, they're some of them can be quite plotting, actually. You know,
like, please die, one of you, please.
but
appropriately to the, you know,
like the
subject
real
matter.
Real leg dragger of a film, yeah. But you know, I think that you're right. I think that's worth mentioning, that they do they're horrifying on a different, more intellectual level than
like Seinfeld horrifying or something, like the cynicism, like the hell is other people kind of, like that's what scares me about it, like being trapped in the mall or being trapped in this house with these people, or especially like in this weird asylum underground prison with a bunch of assholes. Like that's like scary, much more so.
Well, and it is scary. You're absolutely, the hell is other people is scary, but it's also, I would argue though that there is, and I don't know that they're supposed to be scary, but these wonderful, revolting moments. You know, the little girl with the trowel is great. It's not scary, but it's just you know, and or what's his bucket, the head jerk and Day of the Dead just getting torn apart. You know, these are, it's not subtle.
Well,
it's not a think piece at that moment.
No, yeah. Well, with Day of the Dead, that like that scene and all pretty much they're like more underground. It looks much more like an Italian horror film at night. The entire time of Day of the Dead, it just feels like you're in this military base with some zombies walking around. But once they get down below, it's a completely different stylized horror, and it just becomes about the beauty of that horror. And Dawn of the Dead has this more pastel kind of thing going on with zombies. Like those are beautiful, much more like Argento's Suspiria color. Like Romero's color palette is just off the charts. Like he starts the film on the first shot you see is like red burgundy shag carpet wall. Like what the hell? So
let's return.
I like saw Night of the Living Dead in color today. I'm like, I mean, Night of the Living Dead in black and white, that is a true movie, of course. It's awesome, beautiful in some way. But seeing it in color actually like revealed a lot more that I wasn't noticing about the entire film.
That's a colorized. That's a like an. Who did that? Who's responsible?
I don't know if Romero okayed it or not. I was just like, it's on YouTube. Let's see what this looks like.
We can thank Ted Turner for everything that's been colorized. But
Ted Turner.
to get back to Night of the Living Dead and talk about, because we started to talk about these grisly moments, to talk about violence. Why are these films, Romero's trilogy, what is the place of the intense violence? Because it's something that we talk, because these I think these films, for George Romero, forced the horror film to grow up in a certain sense and become more explicit politically, socially minded. And the horror generates from a different philosophical, maybe not different, but more explicit philosophical and political social place. But that being said, they're also some of the first incredibly violent horror films. And I wonder where those two things meet, intersect. What's their relationship, if there is one? Has anybody else thought about this?
I kind of did, because for Night of the Living Dead in particular, I mean, a lot of scholars will point to, and again, we've just been talking about the media. In 1968, people are watching television, and Vietnam is happening. And so it's not, and frankly, you know, there was a ton of violent imagery from civil rights protests and you know, the news. And so I think a lot of people who have written about this in the past have said that this violence is unprecedented maybe for film, but not for screens.
Well, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there's also something, I don't know, there's almost a purposefulness in that particular kind of violence. I mean, if you think about the effect that watching dead soldiers come home or dying on screen in Vietnam, or dogs being sicked on people in Mississippi, those were images that you know were very effective and that actually you know had a political effect. And I think that that at least in Night of the Living Dead, before it does become just the Savini gore fest.
Yeah.
Which is the reason we have the violence is because it's really fun. I think that we can look at there are two kinds of violence in Night of the Living Dead. There is this grisly zombies, eating stuff from the slaughterhouse out in the yard, eating organs. And then there's the hillbillies out there in this very kind of quiet, controlled, mechanical, picking off zombies at 100 yards. And I think that, and I think that's the way this movie works all around. Is that starts to look a little more frightening.
Yes.
The latter. That idea that we're going to fix everything, and that's what that looks like. Is this organized violence that is so kind of clean and organized in a much creepier way. I don't know.
Yeah, efficient and
right.
Distant, and
even by the second movie, gleeful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not to digress too much from Romero's trilogy, but you can see so many of his influences in The Walking Dead. Because Greg Nicotero, I guess, produces it and everything, and he's tied to Romero, and everyone talks about Walking Dead with this tagline that I think can be applied to this, that we were just talking about. That what is it the real enemy is the humans now.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty much Romero in a large way created this idea of what if we want to call it survival horror, and what I think that really means is people having to get along and cooperate in some sense to survive. But to bring in another point possibly about the violence in Night of the Living Dead, I could almost see it serving almost a surrealist function, Un Chien Andalou, the slicing of the eyeball, this idea of this shock that all of a sudden opens you up to new ideas. And I always thought maybe there was an element of that by, Romero is making you chew on very he has a pretty big axe to grind. And ultimately, this could just be another film. And are you going to be open to what this film is saying if you're enjoying it in the same way you enjoy every other film? Well, not quite. I have to shake you up a little bit so that you can be open to that experience. But just we could talk about Night of the Living Dead for 10 episodes.
Can I throw I'd just like to throw out one idea because I think it's pretty integral to the whole trilogy, and that is, and I think Chris, you already kind of brought this up in one way. This really is about the fragility of civilization. That we can, throw a wrench in the works, and all of our rational civilization, all that enlightenment business, everything just kind of goes directly out the window. That it takes very little. And I find it really fascinating. I think that, we have the completely irrational as figured by the zombie hordes, right? And then what gets posited against that is not really reason, I guess. It's a kind of cold, what Marcuse would call instrumental reason, right? It's all focused on how to and problem solving and how we're going to, and so we can just shack up in a shopping mall and everything will be fine, that kind of thing. But what the Enlightenment meant by reason is completely absent from these films. I mean, there's no hope in any of these movies that any of the groups of survivors that we see is ever going to create something that we would think of as human, as beautiful. They're not going to make art or create societies that will it's really, really dark in that way.
That's a great point, Josh, that I never realized that what the human society is lacking in these films is creativity, essentially. That is not something, all their methods of dealing with this are, yeah, a kind of like cold, practical reasoning that is not very inventive or creative, and in even in Dawn of the Dead, which we're about to move into, you know, their pleasure is derived from just acting out in these prescribed kind of roles within the mall, you know, dressing up in things that already exist and play acting roles that already exist. And there's no creative spark. And I think that is something, because there is this rationality, but there isn't a real desire, and there isn't a passion. I feel like there has to be a comment on something that
I guess by the time we get to the third film, we do have at least one character who is passionately addressing this problem and with an eye toward the future, but he's he's literally a mad scientist who's ethically deeply challenged.
Yeah.
And so even where there is that spark and he's passionate, and he passionately defends his methods and his goals, but he's also doing horrible things. And ultimately, the thing he's passionate about is kind of slavery. So, which makes it even more cynical, because then not even creativity gets a pass.
But there's not even that, like, you know, art and creativity can't save us, you know. And I guess in the end, we will have to talk about, is there anything that Romero posits is something that could, you know, save us, or at least help us to overcome like our own national, you know, these tendencies that either are natural or have been programmed in us to, you know, want to destroy each other. But let's talk about now Dawn of the Dead, which is 1978. It's the sequel to Night of the Living Dead. It's this, to me, is the film that, I mean, Night of the Living Dead introduced these ideas, but Dawn of the Dead, I think, is one of the most substantial, important American films of the 70s, maybe of all time. It does so many things. It is so many things. It's interested in so many things, and it's also incredibly entertaining. And it's a very popular film that is incredibly bleak and incredibly critical. And I think that's and very expressly a thinking film, and I think it's a really difficult thing to do. And I think it's an oddity in American film, in a certain sense. But Josh, do you want to summarize Dawn of the Dead briefly?
Sure. So as Lindsay pointed out, we begin this film in a newsroom with that great shot that kind of pans down to take in our character, and we see a couple of journalists and a couple of police officers basically trying to escape the mayhem as things have gotten noticeably out of hand since the last film, and they commandeer a helicopter and decide to get away, and end up landing in a shopping mall, and kind of take up residence there, and kind of go about the business of dealing with the zombies within the shopping mall, finding ways to keep them out, and basically kind of recreate, again, a nice little kind of facsimile of a bourgeois 1970s existence, which then gets torn apart again when Tom Savini and his gang show up to try and take over what they've got, and it becomes a battle again with the living dead, but also with the living, who turn out to be maybe worse. And it doesn't end well for anybody.
And there's gallons and gallons and gallons of blood.
That's right. And wheelbarrow racing through the mall. It's got everything for everybody.
Yes.
There's a really, I mean, this, you know, Night of the Living Dead is almost this claustrophobic kind of, you know, piece of theater in a certain sense, and Dawn of the Dead is this anarchic kind of freewheeling insanity. It's a much bigger movie. It's got a huge scope. It's a fairly long film, and it just has this kind of wild kind of splatter aspect to it. I just don't mean simply in, splattering blood, but there is just this kind of explosion that happens with this film, and I think this is where we see the moment of kind of absolute chaos that this apocalyptic scenario. This is the ultimate moment, I feel like, in the trilogy of real chaos in a lot of senses. And that chaos doesn't mean that sometimes these people aren't happy. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of things going on, but there is just a lot of possibilities and bizarreness. Like, this film has a lot of threads, a lot of things happening. Does anybody want to talk about something that I find very interesting about this is when our protagonists arrive, they say at one point that why are the living dead coming to the mall? And they say, well, it's something that they remember from when they were alive. They remember wanting something that was here. And I think that's very interesting, and pretty damn explicit.
Yeah. I love that it's obviously we're dealing with the use of consumer as a descriptor here in a lot of ways, but it's such an early criticism of malls in just all by itself. I mean, they talk about, I think that in the dialogue they say it's one of those new enclosed malls.
Yeah, big indoor mall.
Yeah, and it's this is the first time that, and does anybody before Romero frame up zombies in this way as these ghouls?
I mean, there might be something that is similar in certain sense, but I don't think the flesh eating.
Yeah, and it's dovetails so beautifully with everything he wants to talk about. I mean, really, within the first half hour, we have the TV studio and a housing project and a mall, just like boom, boom, boom. And so, yeah, as you point out, it's pretty expansive.
It's expansive, but also I think it's important that it's almost like a survey. Like it's almost in a lot of sense like Dante's Inferno, like in a certain sense, like where we're traveling to these different locations, these different circles, and we're seeing, something, a new kind of horror, with a new kind of horror that has meaning. Because
that's a really good point.
Yeah, all of this is interconnected in a certain sense. The project is connected to the mall, is connected to the studio, and I feel like they're flying around and they're surveying their world and watching it be destroyed and realizing, this, and there's this false sense that in some way they're going to go to the mall, because the real irony, and I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about this, the real irony is they almost scoff at the zombies and they can't believe that they want to come here. Why do they come here? Because they're dead. But they are also there.
Mm-hmm. What is it? I have some notes I wanted to talk about the mall, of course. My notes on the mall. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's some scenes that, like, I don't know, we could chew on. What is it? There's when they're getting guns and everything, there's like African chant music going on, and it gives you the sense that like it has animal sounds, like they're caged animals. Like Romero's like taking all these elements to like, yeah, pretty much like you're at the mall, but you're in a cage. And he just like he has all these tracking shots going through the leaves of like the mall plants, like constantly throughout the film, and also the mannequins. Like the entire film like has things going on, but it's just he's the mall itself. He is constantly showing you in these weird ways to kind of put his entire, what would it be? Just what he's thinking out there. So
Well, I think Lindsay, I think
of it, I think, is the once we get to the mall, it all becomes surface. It's it gets a little postmodern, but the just down to the way that that horrible like Muzak kind of takes over and becomes the soundtrack for a large portion of the movie, and the way that we can talk about the way soundtrack overlaps there, where we expect a film to have a soundtrack, and here Their Lives in the Mall has that horrible jaunty
Oh God.
sound
that's the worst part.
that kind of goes with the escalators and everything, and that there is this this kind of Walt Disney kind of existence that's in every aspect there.
It's also interesting. I think for me, the most horrifying moment is because Fran foreshadows in the beginning, like she kind of says, like, no, this is the worst thing for us to do, and no one's really listening to her. People listen to her most in this movie, or at least men do, but they all stay there anyway. So, and then when she finally gives in and she's putting on the makeup, it's just like, even if you had like the desire not to be a part of this weird, like living, non-living mall arena, you're going to get sucked in no matter what.
Well, let's think about, I think something that's interesting is the flight from, the new studio to the project to they go to the mall. And Lindsay, what you were saying about tracking shots, and Romero takes a lot of time to kind of show what this place looks like, and shows you a lot of it. And in essence, it becomes the world, where there's nothing really outside of this. Mm-hmm. This is where this drama is taking place. And I feel like that's echoed in their attitude toward it. They build a wall, they get everybody out that they don't want in there, they get the zombies out, and they have created a little society for themselves that exists unto itself, that has everything they could possibly want, and it doesn't have to be affected by the apocalypse that's happening outside. I think
yeah, go ahead.
No, please, Josh.
No, I just wanted to continue that thought. I think that the settings are just absolutely integral to these films, and I think that in Night we get kind of the locus there is the home, that there's something kind of domestic about it, that it's the civilization is falling apart, and here we have this kind of little ad hoc family that's very dysfunctional, and it doesn't work, and by the end we have the most extreme symbol of the family dynamic falling apart, with the little girl killing her mother. And then in this film, we get, like you said, this kind of microcosm where we everything about this movie kind of telescopes out. And so, yeah, we're now outside the domestic realm, the home, and now we're in this kind of little. This is our little version of society. Like you said, everything's there. All of your needs are taken care of. We even have trees and things, right?
Yeah.
And an IKEA commercial.
Let's see if we can rebuild something in this little society, and of course that doesn't work either for the exact same reasons. And when we get today, I think it gets to something else. But yeah, I just want to say, I think that the settings there are super important, and not just because of the shopping mall consumerism stuff.
No, but I think it was you, that the apocalypse outside is a pretty important phrase.
Yeah, I mean, that's their willful kind of ignorance and rejection of the rest of the world, is essential to their happiness and survival, and they want to protect it from other people that want the same thing. And it's strange, growing up. I mean, I've seen this movie many, many times. I love it. It's one of my favorite films, but I think only at a certain point did I realize that our protagonists are not particularly anyone that I think is a particularly moral or ethical person, or someone that I can really
relate to
what they're doing. Yeah. I mean, if we were to shift the perspective to the biker gang at the end that wants the same thing they want, these people could quickly become the villains.
Oh yeah, well that's where Bougie should come back in here too. I mean, they're hoarding this tremendous resource, and that could save lives, obviously, which is hard not to see the giant metaphor there.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think it's very interesting that Romero makes these our protagonists and in certain ways our surrogates, and I think that's a really damning technique that he uses, because you can watch this and be very comfortable relating to those people and their struggle.
And even more diabolically, like the little home that they make, which is not in the mall proper, but in some, sort of hidden area, is very inviting. It's beautifully shot. It's really beautifully lit. There's these moments of kind of stillness and what looks like a true family. And I'm going to emphasize what looks like. And that's absolutely makes you identify with and root for them.
It's cozy, and at some point it doesn't seem that bad.
I love the fact that they have to.
Well, it gets a little horrifying when what is it that pretty much when everything falls apart right before the biker gang gets there, and the entire scene where they're fighting over turning the TV off, but all there is static, and that is the darkest moment for me. I'm just like, what? Like, stop fighting about this. Like,
that's the most realistic moment in the film, as far as I'm concerned. Like, that sounds exactly like a family drama.
Let's slow the pace for a moment and talk about that moment and really talk. Explain like what's happening in that scene, and then, so in that moment, they've been in the mall for a while. They've gotten all the zombies out. Our main characters have built a little almost apartment for themselves that keeps them hidden from, anyone who might even make their way in the mall, human or zombie. And time is passing, and they keep checking the radio and the television to see if there's any news of anything, and finally they just start to kind of turn on each other, and there's this incredible tension because one of them wants to have the television on just in case something comes on, and another one is telling them that they want it off. I'm trying to remember exactly what happens.
I think it was Fran who wants it off. And Steven wants it on.
If I'm remembering, is she wants it off because she is saying there's nothing.
Yeah, it's like 2 weeks or 2 months or something, like where she has a reasonable argument for wanting to turn it off. So
yeah, and it's just there's this kind of, I think in Dawn of the Dead we start to see the transition of these, because in all three of these films there is a female character that is hugely important. In Night of the Living Dead, there is Barbara, who essentially, early in the film, kind of loses her mind.
Catatonic.
She regresses to a childlike state. So
yeah, and so she's pretty much out of the picture for most of it. Then in Dawn of the Dead, we have our female character who is she's involved somewhat in the decision making, but someone pointed out early no one wanted to listen to her when she says this is not a good idea. But slowly, I think we actually see a real transition in Dawn of the Dead where she starts to want things for herself and really is not too enthusiastic or comforted by the decisions that these men around her are making. She wants to learn how to fly the helicopter herself. You know what I mean? So she can get away. She doesn't want to delude herself by thinking that someone's going to come to save them, or that there's going to be a news signal. And I think, you really see a change and a transition that is where she's revealed to be probably the most clear thinking out of everyone.
Or is it? It's usually the most rational person of these groups in all the films are usually the ones with the least amount of power. So.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It's also interesting that opening shot with her in the newsroom, shows her in what appears to be pretty much like a catatonic state, like we find Barbara in the first movie. She's just kind of leaning against the wall, kind of blank. And so, I mean, that transition seems pretty overt. Like, I like to believe that Romero has a certain amount of guilt about Barbara's character in the first movie.
Totally did.
She's so useless,
I think maybe she just wasn't that good of an actress in reality, and he was just making like, I believe, Barbara could have been badass. I like to think Tom Savini's remake was just him getting the original script or something. I don't know. So
yes.
I think what's always interested me about Barbara is that she gives us all this exposition for something we've seen. She gets a ton of screen time to just reiterate what's already been portrayed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, there could be some significance to that in this kind of. Well, that's just another digression. But I do want to say that I think that as much as it could be Romero definitely apologizing for the Barbara character, by there being 3 films with this very particular arc of, it's not the same character, but a female protagonist, like, we are able to see a real arc that happens there with the role of a female character, like in these films. Whereas it's interesting to think that in Land of the Dead, that's over.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah, there isn't a woman character like that's a big deal in it.
Land of the Dead? I mean, this in Land this trilogy.
They're kicking around there, but they're not primary.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
So I think
there's that really uncomfortable scene in Dawn where
the abortion scene?
Yeah, where the 2 guys are just sitting around, having a nice conversation about whether she should have an abortion or not,
Yeah, that scene's amazing.
That is wonderfully uncomfortable.
It's also interesting she never does give birth. Like, I actually forgot, like, was she pregnant or not? It doesn't become as big of a concern, it feels like, for her. I don't know, am I imagining things? Was I missing a cue? Yeah. But also, just rewinding back a little bit to what you said with starting off and kind of in Dawn of the Dead we have similar shots also with Day of the Dead, because it starts off with her waking up from a nightmare, and it also does that with Fran. So it's like he is kind of like having a continued argument. And it's also interesting, like, with the role of the woman being a protagonist in these films, it's a loose protagonist kind of state. It's never really like it starts off and then it peters out and comes back, and it always like is on a weird loop-de-loop as far as the narrative goes.
Well, these men keep asserting control is what happens. I mean,
Yeah.
over and over again.
Yeah, but like, I guess that's where, Romero's way of making the film is very interesting, because like if she were still the protagonist throughout with all these men making decisions, we would still like kind of feel more her plight, I guess, or more through her eyes, and we never really quite get there, That's my opinion. So.
Point of view is diffuse. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's like actually something that adds to this kind of, in a sense, like makes these movies kind of bleak. That I feel like that we can't escape into or feel comfortable just slipping into someone as our POV or as our surrogate. We're forced into what is seemingly a pretty seeming objective way to look at this situation. Two things about that I think before we move into Day of the Dead. One, we talked about media, and this begins with just media just crumbling. And we're even, they're at a television station. It's total chaos. And we're even given this, we're privy to this moment where we find out that the help centers and these rescue centers that the news are telling people that are, a refuge for them to go, we find out that these places it's not current, the infant that they're putting on air, and that people could be going to dangerous situations, going to their death. But the director of the news program, whatever, says, no, I want I want us to keep showing those names because people will keep tuning in if we keep showing them this information. And that's a deeply cynical moment. And I mean, we live in that was 1978. I mean, I think we are far beyond being naive about that now. But again, I think that it's a transition into even the news media in Night of the Living Dead is still a source of, it can be trusted. They don't know what's going on, but it's not something that's diabolical or something. In Dawn of the Dead, that's removed. We don't have there's no babysitter. There's no mom and dad anymore. Like there's
a guy with an eye patch who sounds like Orson Welles.
Yeah.
I think that by Dawn,
and
the way that the media is operating is as you said, completely untrustworthy and cynical, but it is that meaning giving force. I mean, that's that. Thus, the argument in the mall about whether they leave the static-filled TV on or not. I mean, these are people living out a completely empty existence and looking to their usual source for purpose, and it's not there. And we get to see from the beginning that even if it were there, it's empty and cynical anyway. So, yeah, pretty bleak stuff.
Yeah, looking to illusions for some kind of meaning, and then the illusion is removed, and we're still looking at the device. I mean, this is a movie. There's nothing sacred in this film.
I think there's a beautiful metaphor in this movie that I would. I love. We talked about their little apartment that they literally build. I love that they're in a mall and they actually put up a false wall.
Yeah.
Like that just seems like the greatest metaphor ever. Like what does that even mean, a false wall? You put up studs and drywall and no, that's a wall. This is 20th century America. That's how you build a house, It's like
arrangement of space is an illusion.
Right. I mean, it's like they've just made a home, in this place, but it's it's meant to be artificial, and there's no way to differentiate between their artificial home and what we would consider a home anyway. It's
what is it? Is it Romero's? I read or heard somewhere that he was it was from this. I was watching Scream Greats starring Tom Savini, and he was talking about how him and Romero were arguing about the makeup and everything because Romero wanted the more Argento stuff. So all this artificialness seems to even go far into the flesh of the zombies themselves. Like he wanted it to look like a comic book. So all the artificialness, and it'll just kind of push it more.
That's
I
think
it works.
I was going to say that this idea of building a room within a mall, like building a home or another space within an already quote unquote false space, it seems like something that is this kind of critique of the me generation, and this idea that just even within this false world you have to build an even smaller space for yourself.
No, it goes back to it goes back to Night, where they have to create their little domestic space within the little society that they're pretending still exists.
Yeah.
Well, is it? You see it in Night of the Living Dead, mainly with Barbara and Ben, when he's kind of boarding everything up. She is grabbing the tablecloths and folding them and touching all the lace in the house. I feel like that's to me when I see Barbara touching things, okay, now this is an important point because she's longing for this bourgeois domesticity that he's tearing apart in order for them to survive.
Oh, that's a really good point. That's very interesting.
Let's talk day.
She's a talker, Barbara.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
One thing I do. One point I do want to bring up about John, though, is Peter's transition into becoming a zombie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is the only time we see that, I believe, in the trilogy.
Yeah.
does that have any feelings about that? The significance of that?
It becomes a trope in later, all kinds of later zombie films, but I think you're right. And it is, it's almost, I mean, the apocalypse has come home, literally. And again, Romero makes us look at it.
Yeah. Also, like talking way back earlier in the conversation, like talking about how there were no creative individuals in these groups. Like if we're going to talk about like just the notion of a creative individual, like I thought he was the most creative. Like he kind of like was losing it near the end before he got bit, because he was like having an adventure and pretending and having fun outside of the mall. Like to me that was like there's creativity, and it bit him in the ass literally, and he's going to die for it. And that's probably why there's no creative individuals, because like that personality type usually has a tendency to get themselves into trouble with the dead.
It is a situation that seems to require a high level of practical behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, I think something interesting is that when we see this, I feel like it's a really powerful moment when he's kind of, it's almost like he's, coming on, he's like detoxing or something. I mean, he's like having this, it's like he's having this moment where he's transitioning to becoming the living dead. And we're waiting for this moment where we see what we're watching, like almost trying to remember the moment where you fall asleep, like this thing that we're not capable of doing as human beings, but they're watching. We want to see, when does the change happen? When do you go from becoming A to B? Because that, in that sense, if we could see that, we would feel safe in some way, but we don't. And the horror is just reinforced.
Yeah, I think so, but I think it also is just an echo of, going and putting on the lipstick. I mean, it's the same movement. It's that, exactly what Lindsay said, which is that you can reject all of this, but it's gonna suck you in anyway, that you can't escape it. You will become one of them.
All right, let's move in now to talking about Day of the Dead. And Carlen, you think you can summarize Day of the Dead?
I can give it a shot. There's definitely a lot going on. Day of the Dead opens with, obviously, I think Lindsay already talked about this nightmare that one of our protagonists is having. And she wakes into a helicopter, and they're landing in a Florida town, and it's pretty clear that the apocalypse has happened, that the world is completely filled with zombies, and they land. There's no one there to be found. What's her name? Sarah? Is that right? Part of a sort of science team that is based in an underground bunker with a military force. And we learn over the course of the film that this science team has been sending the military people up to collect zombies for experimentation. And eventually there is a clash between the military and scientific forces, and all the zombies get into the bunker. And shall I go on? We do have an important character in the form of a sentient zombie called is it Bub? Am I hearing that right?
Bub.
It is
Bub. And he is being studied by our doctor, Dr. Logan, and being sort of trained to remember things like how a phone works, and that you should salute someone in uniform and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay. So that being said, an interesting thing about this entry into the trilogy is that the military, who were this kind of always this distant thing, I feel like, in the films, are now, there's no more running, there's no more hiding. We're trapped in a bunker with, these soldiers. And that's all that's left now, is the military and scientists. And I think there's something important about that, that Romero is kind of, even these people who are somewhere helping us are now, they're the ones that are trying to survive. and what answers do they have, and are they faring any better? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, just to reiterate what I said before, I mean, I think that those, there are kind of instrumental reason just kind of laid out in its, as figures, as types right there, the scientist and the soldier, their brands of problem solving are pretty specific and pretty narrow, and horrible. I mean, there's like one person in this movie that you might like, and he doesn't really seem to fit in. There's also these guys, our one black character again, and then his friend, who seem to be kind of on the periphery of those two groups.
Yeah, they're neither. Yeah. I think they're really interesting, and I also like from the outset you've got like the Irish guy, and they're so figured in those ways. And one of these actors actually is Irish, but it's so strange. It's like Jamaican guy and an Irish guy get on a helicopter. And the punchline is much later.
Stereotypes in this compared to the other films.
Oh man.
Yeah, and it's weird. There's that going on, and that always seems to be what is like unique about Day of the Dead for me. Like, but the good thing with Day of the Dead is it kind of creates this platform where you can kind of like sit and do work, and really the first time we're opening up the skull and trying to figure out what it is that's going on, to like pretty much investigate, like with science's hand, like what's going on with the living dead and how they're operating. So, and pretty much the closest answer we get to is with Bub, kind of it becomes a Frankenstein story at that point. So we're starting to emphasize more with the dead. So at least Day of the Dead opens that up where we start to sympathize with the zombie a bit more.
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead, Josh. Sorry. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I mean, and that is like the most cynical move of the whole trilogy right there, which is that, we start out with the horror of the zombie, which is that they exist in this liminal space where, the line between what is alive and what is dead has been eroded. And then by the time we get to this point, it's kind of eroded in a different direction where, really the lines between us and these masses of bloodthirsty zombies are deteriorating even more, because it seems that they do have memories. They can be taught to respond to, stimuli in the way that we do. And, that's even more horrifying, I think.
Stephen King, too.
What's that?
And he's the first zombie, I guess,
Bub.
too.
Right.
So,
yeah,
he's a new species, I guess.
I think Lindsay brought up this evolution or devolution kind of idea, and it, it's more like just human beings are just, superfluous at this point. I mean, really, it looks like the zombies are able to do most of the stuff that we take for granted, and they don't have half of our wants and needs.
Yeah,
they can do all those things without all of our pesky, individuality and requirements.
They don't have a 5-year plan like us.
It's interesting that at least they know what they want, and they can mobilize. But the other thing that is interesting is that we do see that they do maybe have some kind of memory or can learn in a certain sense, but it's these rudimentary things that they're being taught, like, how to pick up a phone and essentially to play human in a certain sense. And it's kind of this idea that we're trying to protect ourselves and escape creatures. But we think a way to prevent that is if we can teach them again to domesticate them or teach them how to be human. But we will always fail because of what being human is predicated on a very empty, misunderstood idea of what makes us different than them. If we teach them to do these few things, like the things that we do, then we'll be the same.
Well, technically culture, like trying to teach a zombie culture won't make them human.
Well, and the fact that, the entire film of Dawn of the Dead was about people playing human. I mean, that's kind of the whole theme of that whole film is that these people are, they're bub, right? I mean, they're just going through the motions, kind of in an empty way, playing what they think it means to be human.
So the violence in Day of the Dead is, again, it's kind of continuing, this gleeful kind of cartoonish, hyper, thing that we see in Dawn of the Dead. But there's another kind of violence in Day of the Dead that I think actually is more horrifying and a new element in the trilogy, or taken to a new level, is this verbal violence.
Oh yeah.
The histrionics and the the crudity and there's the presence of sex, sexuality and violence in Day of the Dead that's not really present in the other films. It's a coarser kind of thing, and I think that differentiates this from the others, and it makes it, for me, unsettling in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the most sexual threatening one out of all of them, because she is by herself in there, and what is it? Her lover in the beginning is losing his mind.
Yes.
So she doesn't really have a partner, as she once did, and it's just I like the Dead, but it's definitely hard to watch. It reminds me of how I feel when I watch I Spit on Your Grave. So
I think there's a lot of, some of that's pretty indicative of the era. This is really when we're ramping up conversations about, ERA, and there's honestly, historically in context, there's just a lot of hostility toward women, particularly professional or powerful women. And Sarah is. She's smart and competent here. But also, there's a lot of these mid-'80s movies that are just very yelly. There's a lot of screaming.
All right, well, I'd like to thank all of you for a great discussion about these great films that are all highly recommended. Dawn of the Dead, I think, probably the high point in the trilogy, but all have something to offer. But yeah, I'd like to thank you, Josh, thank you, Carlen, thank you, Lindsay. Any parting words?
Rest in peace.
Thanks very much for asking me to join for this conversation. It was really fun.
Yeah, that too.
And who knows, maybe you might return. Anyway, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us on The Brood, and we'll talk to you next time.